Hello, 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 hello. Good morning. How awake is everyone? Just as awake as I am. Thank you, Mike. We are gathered here today on the Open Space Day of Codegarden, and I hope you've got at least your brain is a little bit active, and you got your power bars in over there. And we'll be doing our first hour talking about Codegarden Retreat and all the things that we did there. What is Retreat? Retreat is traditionally the few days before Codegarden where we gather with a few people from HQ and a few people from the community who've been interesting to us this year, who have ideas, who know how to express those ideas, and we would like to talk to them for a while. And what we do at Retreat is we have a lot of beer, and in between those beers, we actually do very productive work in workspaces. We hack a little bit. This year we didn't hack very much because we're so corporate now. We need to come up with processes and stuff like that. So we made RFCs instead, which is amazing. So we'll be sharing a little bit of what we did there. Can I ask the PR team to come up on stage? First group of people that worked together was the PR team. We've got Emma and Anders, and we got Purnima. Big applause. I think I started the contribution group by saying I also have a dream. We're all talking about dreaming this year, so I have a dream about bots, and I don't really like robots very much because they're just things and not very human. For my work on pull requests, I've always resisted actually getting bots to do the work for me, because that just feels like it's cheating and we're not actually talking to people. You know, we're software people, we don't really want to interact with people, so we just make the bot do it, and then we can't blame anyone for anything, right? But it became apparent over the past year that we have such high activity on GitHub that we actually could use a little bit of help. And my thought was, how can we make this nice, friendly, and helpful for everyone involved, not just a bot to ignore the human side of things. Currently, all the replies you see appearing on GitHub on your issues and on your pull requests are completely manual, so we actually have to go in and reply to every single one, which sometimes leads to me being in a little bit of a hurry and just slapping a label on and going, they'll know what it means. But most of the time, people don't actually, they're not used to using this process. So there was a few thoughts around this. Mostly, there is a few labels that we can easily put an automatic message under, but make it friendly as well. So, for example, we now have built a bot a friendly robot, the Umbra bot, that responds to certain types of labels. So when I put an up for grabs label on there, it will say, hey, this sounds like a great idea. Maybe you want to take this and fix it, or maybe someone else can take it and fix it. The release labels, so whenever we put release /810 on there, that means, a lot of people don't know, that means that this feature or this issue will be fixed in the upcoming release 810. There's a few HQ discussion labels as well, which means that I don't know what to respond right now. I will need to take it to the team at HQ and talk about it there. So we can easily make sure that we get a proper reply there, instead of me being in a hurry and putting a label on there and forgetting to actually say something real. And we can now create, which is amazing, who has a contract badge on our? Yes, cool. Who has an accepted pull request but never got their contract badge on our come see me later, and soon we will just have this automatically linked together on our Umbraco, which is great. Can I get an applause for the people who have a contract badge already? Thank you for your contributions. It's a little bit small, but it looks like this. It has our lovely heart on it, and it says, "Hi, Jen, we're writing blah, 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 thank you." And the good part about this is that we can actually give our bot a few different replies to randomly choose between, so it actually feels like it's not always the same message. We actually give it a bit of a human element to it, so a bit of whimsy there. This all runs from nodes in Umbraco, so hey, we use a content management system to put content somewhere, it's great. Next up I want to invite Purnima to the stage, who is going to talk about hot topics a little bit. There you go.
Thanks, Seb. So this was one of the ideas that cropped up on the first day of the retreat, and we thought it was a really good way of trying things out. So the name says it all. So to put more context around this, we are an open source community, and collaboration is the key. And we collaborate, converse over various tracks and channels, and it gets pretty busy and sometimes quite difficult to track down as well in that case. So we came up with an idea so that if there is a topic, an issue or a PR which is gaining momentum, perhaps in the way which HQ hadn't anticipated, we can try and do something about it so that HQ can step in when it is most needed, so that the input from the community is still valid and is still not lost. So a Slack integration was the idea that we came up with. So in a case where a PR or an issue has busy conversations, even before an HQ team member or one of us from the PR team steps in, we post that out to a Slack channel, hot topics. So this makes sure that HQ has an oversight of what's happening, and they can step in and channel their focus and attention on issues when it is most needed. And input from the community is still valid and it's still not lost. So I think this is pretty much up there. So Seb is doing final tests on it before it kicks into action. So that's about hot topics. Back to Seb.
Thank you. And as a last added bonus, which was totally unplanned, but it's going to be very fun. I don't know if Anders has seen this slide yet, but Anders has been working in some downtime there on making sure that we can soon log in with our GitHub account on our Umbraco, and actually also sign up with your GitHub account, so that we don't even have to think about linking those things together anymore. It'll just be automatic. So good work there. I'm looking forward to it. That's it for us for the PR team. Next up is the docs team. Can we flip him? If your laptop turns on.
Oh, shoot.
Did you want to have the docs team on the stage as well behind you?
Of course.
Please give them a big hand. And you're mic'd up. Do you need anyone else?
No, that's fine. Yes, hello. So we are the documentation curators. We're missing 2 people who couldn't make it to retreat, but instead we had Lottie join us as an honorary member. We would like to talk about what we did at retreat. It's something that sort of started last year at Codegarden. We had an open circle. We had a lot of focus on improving the getting started section. So we wanted to do some restructuring of the way the documentation is set up. And that sort of led us down a rabbit hole. We figured out that we had some tools that just were not optimal at all. So we ended up sort of going into a more tooling focus and creating a new site. basically. There we go. So this is the team that was at Retreat. Very hardworking people, so please give them a round of applause. Yeah, so as I said, we had some issues with the current tooling. Right now the documentation is served through Hour, and there's some custom integration where we pull from GitHub and serve it all. The menu structure is an issue because it's automatically generated based on the folder structure. We don't have any style guidelines, so it's hard for us sometimes to manage pull requests. The API documentation is there, but it's hard to find, and it's not automated at all. It's something we manually put into the site. And then we're very dependent on someone to deploy changes to Hour whenever we want to upgrade something. And we're not allowed to do that ourselves. So yeah, here's an example of something that we have to work with. The menu structure, as I said, is automatically generated, but then we can override it with a big switch statement where we order stuff. It's not that great. So we had some dreams of things we would like to improve in the documentation. We would like to be able to manage the menu structure ourselves. Sometimes it might even make sense to have one article in several locations in the menu structure. We would like to be able to reuse images more. The current structure, they're supposed to be next to the articles in the tree, but an image of the back office could be used in 20 different articles instead of loading the whole repo. Like I said, we're dependent on someone to deploy changes to Hour. We would like to be able to have an easier deployment process ourselves. We would like to also include the API documentation in a better way. And yeah, there's a few things, versioning and some style guide. So we have been working on Umbraco Superdocs. It's a working title. So the things we have actually made at the retreat is a new site. It's going to be independent of Hour, but it's going to be integrated into Hour. So when you go to Hour and you click documentation, you go to the new site, and then there's linking back to Hour as well. It's its own deployment flow, so we can actually work on it. It's built on DocFX. I don't know if anyone here knows DocFX, but it's the framework that Microsoft uses for their documentation as well. It has some cool features and so on. Whoops. But let's just see it. So if you start on Hour, as it looks today, you will be able to go to documentation, which leads you to this new site. It gives us more flexibility because we can split up things like the getting started section, can be outside of the normal documentation, can have its own section here. It has some strong markdown features that are not currently supported. For example, you can have tabs. So if you miss tabs from the CMS, just go to the documentation and you can find some tabs here. You can do different, for example, how to install on different OSs. You can do code examples with and without models builder, all that kind of stuff. So an example we've made here is installing Umbraco on Windows and then the equivalent on Mac. So we have the regular documentation as you know it. There's the API documentation is automatically here. We even managed to include the Angular API documentation, which was a bit of a hack, but it's all part of the site. One of the really strong features is that you can link to API documentation. So if you want to learn something about examine extensions, you can link directly to the API documentation for that. And it also has some possibilities of extending the descriptions, because all of this is automatically generated based on the code. You can even see the source if you want. So you can see there's a summary here. But you can also click Improve the Stock, which will create a pull request for you, which will just be a markdown file that already has a specific name and UID, which then will link it up. So I did that, for example, for a method here. So you can insert your own things, images, guides, whatever, for a specific method into the API documentation, but it's not something that lives in the code base. It is a markdown file that is on the documentation itself. If you want a more realistic example, then it could be something like this. We currently have documentation on services that has things like this, how to get the service, which is not something you would like to have in a long comment in the code, but then you can extend it and add it here. Yeah, so those are just a few of the features. There's a few more, but don't have time to show them all. Yeah, so the main advantages of doc effects, like I showed you, you can link to API documentation and back to regular documentation. There's a new way of linking content. You can still do it by path, but you can also link to a UID of a markdown file. So if you move stuff around, it's still going to link to the same thing. There's file inclusion, so you can have snippets, for example, that you can reuse throughout the documentation. Tabs, like I showed. It also automatically checks for links in all markdown files. So if there's a link that doesn't work, because it's a relative link and it's sometimes hard, then it's going to tell you that that link doesn't resolve to anything. Yeah. So one other thing we also talked about was introducing a style guide to the documentation. We found a tool called Veil. If any of you saw Chris Ward's presentation about documentation yesterday, he showed Veil a little bit. It's a way of testing style rules. So we have tried to set up Veil in this new site, and we made an RFC. You can find it on the Umbraco RFC GitHub, where we would like to talk about which rules to use. So go check that out. Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely. Next up is Carol and her buddies to talk about RFCs. And if we can switch over the screens again.
I brought a second mic so you can...
Give them a big applause.
You want me to start and introduce? Yeah? No, or do you want me to introduce you?
We have 2 or 3 mics.
Okay. Okay. Hi, good morning. We have 3 things to talk about, really? And we have, well, 2 RFCs to talk about, but before we talk about RFCs, we'll talk about what an RFC is. Yep. Take it away, Carol.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you. So on day 1 of the retreat, we were at HQ, and we were the team to look at .NET Core. So we started to think about the roadmap for .NET Core and how we might present that in an RFC to the community. But then we realised we don't know what an RFC looks like, or not for Umbraco anyway. So we thought we would try and define how we can share that. So in most communities we looked at, RFC was request for comments, but we thought contributions would be a better one for Umbraco. It's not just to comment on something, but we actually want feedback and collaboration and contribution. So as it says there, a request for contribution is a detailed proposal for a significant change or new feature that will be reviewed and discussed by HQ and the community. So I think a key part of that is like a significant change or new feature, because we still want a lot of things to still go on GitHub issues or discussions to happen on our, and only when they're defined and in the template that we're going to show, that's when they should be an RFC. So in RFCs, yeah, I'm not going to read out the bullet points, but basically it will let people who are experts give that contribution and give ideas, and then it can be reviewed by the community, and also give documentation for why that decision was made for in the future when people want to know why. It's like, well, we have a document explaining everything around it, the drawbacks, the assumptions, and why the decision was made. So we thought that was really cool. So the format, which we'll take you through one of the RFCs, but the format is a summary, a motivation for why you would want that project to happen, the intended audience of the RFC, because not all are going to be for developers, a detailed design or description of what you want to happen, the drawbacks of it, so if there's breaking changes or anything like that, alternatives, what's out of scope, because we know that discussions can just quickly go like way off on a different conversation, so we want to make sure that RFCs are really defined. Seb, your battery's running out. And any unresolved issues, run. And I get all the technical issues this year, that's great. And yeah, any related RFCs, which as we're going to discuss, a few of them are kind of related, so any reading you should do that's related to that. And then once we had a format, I literally can't do anything, can I? Oh, good. Yeah, so we now have a template, as Niels mentioned in the keynote, that people, once it's opened up, can fill in the template and submit RFCs for feedback. You made it. Yeah, so then we got to the point we could actually do an RFC for Project Unicorn. The emoji is necessary. And Shannon can talk about that with Stefan.
Cool. Thanks. Do we have anything else? I think that was good. Nothing else about RFCs? The RFCs site is on GitHub. I guess the only thing to mention about that is it's a request for contributions to comment and to tell us what you think. And to do that, the RFCs are just pull requests. So if you want to comment on the pull request, please do. Right?
Also, RFCs are not things that are going to be open forever and ever for people to discuss for months. So usually when we create an RFC or when RFC is proposed, it goes through, I think, with like 2 weeks or 3 weeks period where we can discuss, and then it's frozen, accepted, done, or cancelled or whatever, but it's not an ongoing discussion for 1 year.
Yep, so once it's posted up there, it'll be up, and then a decision will be made, and a time frame will be posted on the PR for when it's going to be closed. Cool. So we made a couple RFCs, which we will talk about. So I guess the point of what we did at the retreat was to figure out how we can move to .NET Core. So then we had to make an RFC process to figure out how we're going to get there. And then we realized the journey is quite long. So we had to break it down into subsections. So we actually designed the journey of how we get there, and then we made one RFC for the first part of it. I don't know what the next slides are, so bear with me. Cool. Okay, so yeah, I think the biggest point of this slide is something that we're terming the minimal disruption approach. We want to get to .NET Core as I guess quickly and painlessly as possible, and we also want you to get to .NET Core with Umbraco as quickly and painlessly as possible. I think we would all agree that that's a good approach, but this is what the RFC is for. So in our opinion, it would be better for you to go to V8 and then be able to go to V9, Project Unicorn. There is no version attached to this. Shh, it's not V9. It's Project Unicorn. So to go from V8 to Project Unicorn with minimal disruption, so the least amount of breaking changes possible. So all the services, APIs, iPublish content, all those things would just transition across. Of course, .NET Core has its own breaking changes, which we'll have to deal with. But the dream is to be able to go to .NET Core from V8 as painlessly as possible. So, the strategy. Yes, we have diagrams. We made diagrams. We worked on them for 2 days. We made even more diagrams, which I can show you, because they're great. So, like, the structure here, and this is all in the RFC, so please feel free to go and browse this. We're starting at top left and going to bottom right. We're calling this the critical path, right? So, start there, go there, time goes this way, right? There is no time frames, just milestones. So we start at the top, we've got 2 RFCs, which is the strategy, which is this, and then the second RFC is the project structure redesign, which starts, that's basically the 50% of it, I think. And then we get to picking a .NET Core version and then moving to .NET Core. The stuff in yellow at the top right, these are things that can be done in parallel once we get to that milestone, like during the critical path. So these are the things that we can start involving the community with in the parallel critical path thing. Yep. Am I missing anything so far? No? Good? Cool? What's that? Yes. So the red boxes, like the red text, is more RFCs. So we haven't written all of them because there's quite a long journey to get to. But when we get to these milestones, we will publish new RFCs. You know, for example, how do we deal with configuration, like going from what we have now to .NET Core. And the end result also is done. In the green, I guess that's the ecosystem that we're going to have to manage. So that's the plan, the minimal disruption approach, which we can talk about today. We could go into detail about this like for a long time, but I think that's what today's about. Talking about the project structure redesign. So this is our current architecture for V7. We had a whole bunch of stuff, for V7, and then V8 we brought it back down to a very small subset of projects, kind of terming it like you need to break down the wall to build it back up type thing. So this is what we've got now, but this is where we want to go. And yes, it is quite a big project structure redesign, and there is a method to this madness, because we could just try to go Umbraco Core, go to .NET Core, all in one big swoop. But that's going to be a lot of work, and it will be very tedious. Same with Umbraco.web. So instead, we want to pull these all out into different areas and make as many things net standard to now before moving to .NET Core. So the plan is, and this is kind of like 50% of the whole project, we break it all out into these structures slowly. We make as much net standard as we can now and make sure the project actually runs without even thinking about going to .NET Core. And then we figure out what just needs to go to .NET Core. And actually it turns out that only 2 projects will end up being .NET Core, which is in here, Umbraco Back Office and Umbraco Web, because those are the only 2 web-based things. Everything else will be net standard or net framework. So, yellow here, I can't remember what the
yellow is net standard?
No, yellow is, yes. The RFC has color codes in it. There's a whole legends in there, but we can talk about it today. Umbraco Core is a dependency-less project. So all the abstractions, POCOs, all the services, all these things that actually have 0 dependencies like Newtonsoft.js. We're not even going to try to include that. At least we're going to try. Infrastructure, this is part of the RFC. What do we call this project? But that's what we've called it for now. This is all the implementations of those things. So that's like the repository layer, database layer, all these things. Then we've got Umbraco Back Office. This is actually really powerful moving forward because now we can say, I just want to have the back office without the front end, right? So that's when you start talking about load balancing. Host the back office UI, I don't need a front end. So the back office there will be a .NET Core thing. It'll be responsible for all the MVC stuff, authentication, authorization, all that stuff. We get to Umbraco configuration. This is red right now because as we transition, we want to make that just net framework until we get to the .NET Core story. And then it'll just be net standard eventually, right? Umbraco Web is going to be .NET Core because that has all the routing and all these things built into it. Umbraco members, we're actually going to remove members entirely for now while we transition, because that's based on membership providers, which is not compatible with Net Standard or Net Core. And then once we get to the .NET Core implementation, we'll bring it back in. Yep. So I can go on and on about this, but that's what we're here to talk about today. At the end of the day, we want to have a project architecture where you can host the back office separately and the front end separately, which is great for everybody, I think, load balancing and otherwise. This also means that there's less code to convert once we get to this project structure, because it will already be net standard, already converted, already working with the code that we have today. Yes, sorry. Is that it?
We just got a GitHub thing of we started the refactor.
Oh yes, we started. So we've already started moving some code, and we have some awesome images. Yep, we made 60 commits. So this is just moving code into an actual net standard project, and the project is building and tests are running. Yep.
Thank you very much. Who's next up on the stage? I can't remember. Okay, you guys. How many? 2?
Yeah. It's on.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, are we over time?
So we are the future of the back office team, also called front-end team, and we were asked to figure out how to make the front-end or move the front-end into a better state. But first, before we could start doing that, we had to figure out what is a better state, and we want to figure that out by setting what would the goals be of moving the front-end into a better state. And for that, we have Laurel presenting what work we did to get closer to that.
So we also produced quite a large RFC for this. And really what we were looking to achieve was facilitating the start of a conversation. So, I mean, we spent a lot of time discussing approaches, questions that we have, priorities that are like things that are important to me, are different than things that are important to Niels, and will be different than things that are important to each of you. But we really wanted to get sort of the first step, like get the door open, to have people having those productive conversations so that we can start making a plan for how to approach this and how to sort of drive it forwards. So it's a non-trivial problem. Like, it's a massive piece of code. There's lots going on in the back office. It's very complex. And as developers, I think it's natural to want to jump to a solution. But really what we needed to define here was the requirements, like what do we want the back office to look like in X period of time, like what's important. So we specifically stayed away from conversations about what technologies we'd use and actually kept it towards like, what do we want to see? So the first question, which actually took a really long time to answer, was why do we want to do this, right? So the back office is written in AngularJS. It's slightly outdated now, but it's still functional. Things still work. So the fact that it's outdated isn't a good enough business case to change everything, basically. So we really need to answer the question, like, why is this important? Like, why do we want to sort of go forwards? So for us, we came up with a few things that are super important to us. So things like making it easy for people to get started and contribute, making it an exciting project that people actually want to get involved with and make it better. And then things like the future, so maintaining it and extending it. And actually, technically, at the moment, it's fairly easy to extend, but the problem is that everybody does it a different way. There's no sort of idea of best practice or using templates or having reusable components that you can sort of slot in. So yeah, this was our core sort of driving focus. And this is all in the document, so I've just pulled sort of the salient points out, but this is just to get the conversation started. So we boiled this down a little bit closer into actual questions that we then wanted to answer, like how can we make the code easier to understand, and at the moment, why is it hard to understand? Like, what are the barriers to getting started? So yeah, there's a separate section in the RFC, which is almost like it's almost a separate sort of request for contribution, right? Like, because it's related, but again, what we think are things that we want to do might be different to what you guys want to do. So, is there anything on that?
I think you're doing great.
Are you covering?
Yeah, sorry.
So, I mean, for Niels, for example, enabling user experience improvements and stuff like that, Niels works as a front-end developer on the existing code base. And because there's tightly coupled code, it's actually quite hard to make quick changes, to make something slightly more accessible, or make something a different color in one place without affecting X number of other places. So yes.
Yeah, so currently it can be hard to change something in the current code, unless you really know it as your own home. So we really want to make it more friendly.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, sorry.
So we also included a proposed approach. So we spoke about a lot of different ways that you could look at these issues, things that are important, and how we'd actually go about introducing them into the existing code base. So the proposed approach goes hand in hand with sort of alternative options. So we spoke about, for example, throwing everything out of the current code base and starting again from scratch, which doesn't make any sense given the scale of the project. You just wouldn't be able to do that. We also spoke about creating a sort of hybrid framework where you're introducing new components and new sections in the new style, but keeping the old ones. But then you end up with a sort of mix of strange architectures, and you're kind of swapping out like for like, where you've got the same issues just in a new framework. So yeah, we discussed a lot of different options, and I know that there's been some really productive discussions, even in the last couple of days, that have broadened our view even on the existing RFC that was created on Monday. So
Yeah, but basically the idea of the RFC is to figure out where do we want to go, and then I think that will serve as a foundation for the conversation on how we can actually do it. So hopefully what we want to achieve with this is to get started on how do we figure out the strategy to move forward with this. Maybe we will have RFCs on strategy. Maybe people can make their own RFCs on how you think it can be achieved, and we can use those RFCs to make sure that we have seen all possible solutions and also heard everyone's voices, and make sure that we try to capture all the interests that are out there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Yeah. Okay. And this one? Oh, okay. No, it's okay. I think we're running out of time, so make it brief. Yeah. So yeah, just to highlight that it is a request for contributions. We really do want to start the discussion, but we don't want it to sort of devolve into a religious debate against one framework versus another framework, which is totally subjective, right? So, yeah, we want to sort of think about what's important and what approach we want to take for it.
Yeah, it's way more important for us to find a solid strategy than figuring out what framework it will become.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that.
Cool. I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it from us.
Sorry to rush you. We can talk about the rest for the rest of the day. Last team. Who needs mics? You. There we go.
Good morning, everyone. We started out as one group working on the next version of the grid because everybody loves the grid, but there are some things that could be made better in the next version of the grid. But once we looked at a lot of different implementations of the grid, we found out actually there isn't one grid to rule them all, but there can be different versions of grids existing besides each other. And we zoomed out a bit and we looked at some use cases, and we actually saw that a lot of editors normally, when they make big blog posts, first type it in Word or Google Docs or something like that, and then want to just copy paste it into something and create a really nice blog post from there. So we decided to split up the group for a moment and first took a look at that use case, how we could do that, copy pasting and create long reads, and the rest of the group looked at how could we create a structure to define blocks or landing page builder or something like that. So the first part I worked on with Antoine and Niels is called Project L'Éditeur. It's a working name for now, but if it's French, it will get eventually in core. So we decided to go for French. And essentially a simple and faster rich text editor. Because what we wanted to do is, once you have your blog post somewhere, to create it as easy as possible and as fast as possible into your website. And we wanted to make sure that even if you have bullet lists, but also images, for example, in your post already, you can just copy over it and the rich text editor will handle everything for you. So it's not an alternative for the grid, but it could be a part of the new grid. And one thing, right now the TinyMCE is in the project, and it has been around for 10 years now, and it served us really well. But if you look at it from at this moment, it's not totally up to date anymore. It's using iframes, for example. Here you see a GIF on a slow 3G connection, and it's loading really slow because it's loading, then it's loading again, then it's loading even more, and then it's loading even more. So, and it's because it's an iframe, and if you have several rich text editors now on a doc type, it's even slower. We came up with some requirements, put them in an RFC, so you can comment on that if you missed some requirements maybe. But we came up with these and looked at a bunch of different rich text editors that are out there. Like the one of medium.com is really good. But we also looked at the WordPress Gutenberg plugin, but also several other editors. But we found, or we think this is the best editor at this moment. It's the Tricks editor. It's built into Basecamp, but it's also open source as a rich text editor. And it has already a lot of functionality out of the box, but it's also really good to extend. It looks really easy. And we did some hacking actually, or Niels did actually, so maybe we should be a bit afraid. But in the proof of concept version it works. It works on any document, also nested content and grid, and it loads really fast. As you will see in this one, it just loads, and it's there. Don't look at the styling yet, because there's lots of things to do, but it looks really promising. And what we need from you guys today, but also in the next week or the next 2 weeks, is look at the RFC. Did we miss some points? Do you maybe have experiences on things you've done in the past? So we know if we're missing something, and otherwise this is the to-do list to extend it even more. So that's the first part.
Yep. Cool. So as Jeffrey mentioned, we started by trying to see how we could improve the grid and kind of divulged into a few other areas that affect the grid. Just quickly, by way of applause or something, who uses the grid to build layouts? Thank you. And who's using something like stacked content to build row-based layouts? Cool. So that seems to be there seems to be a relatively even split. Damn. So we identified a few issues with the current grid that resulted in the work we ended up doing. It being quite slow to load, it jolts around the page. There's a bunch of different use cases. Some people use it for text-based content, some people use it for landing pages, and some people, use stacked content, and some people use the grid, and there's a bunch of different ways of building different layouts. It then becomes quite complex as well to build more advanced structures. So CSS grid doesn't really work with this concept of strict columns. Every block is assigned a width and a height. So the grid currently doesn't support that either. It's a little bit too rigid and too opinionated. It requires that you're using a 12-column bootstrap grid, effectively. We wanted to see if we could make that slightly better. We don't think that the back office, you should be using the back office to dictate design as such, or that the back office should have opinions on how your web page looks, because if you then change your design on the front end, you shouldn't have to go in and re-edit all of your grid and change the layout. In addition to that, it's not natively strongly typed. It's very difficult to search and index because it's just one huge blob of JSON, and there's no support for more of the advanced features that are in V8, like variants. That said, we split off into another project, which we've given a code name Proteus. Proteus is a Greek god of shape-shifting. It's also a bacteria found in poo, but we'll ignore that. We're going to stick with the shape-shifting definition. This is a proposal for a standard for storing structured data in the CMS. So that is including the grid, but something like stacked content, something like nested content, and even the rich text editor in future. What is it? So, as I've said, it's a standard, but more than that, we want to build a foundation for building these complex editors. So something like the grid could be built on top of this block-based Proteus editor. We want to have a fully customizable UI at the kind of implementation level. That means you could implement one version of this editor as a grid, but a different version of that editor as something closer to stacked content, depending on your use case. We're calling this concept blocks. These editors are going to store a list of blocks, and a block is comprised of a few things. It will be an iPublished element, which is a doc type, effectively, without any routing data. You can give properties and things to that. And then also a settings object. We identified that the grid has settings, and people like to put stuff on there to say it's got a background, but stacked content might not have that, for example. We wanted to create a consistent way of dealing with all of that data, so we have a settings object. Out of the box, this will be strongly typed and give you this iPublished element. It could work with Models Builder quite nicely too. We want to not only be able to define the editor UI, but a block level UI, meaning you could have a completely custom experience, or inline previews, or inline editing. You could edit those settings via a UI, so in the data type you can pick what settings you want, and then you can click a cog and they'll slide out and you can edit those. Or you could, in your custom implementation, modify that in AngularJS. So the benefits of this is it completely decouples all of our data, all of our structured data, away from layout. It means that you could present that same grid or same stacked content property in many different ways across your site, which is really, really powerful. It means we can easily tailor the editor experience per editor to the exact use case that you have. And we're not trying to make the grid do things that it shouldn't do, and not trying to do things that stacked content shouldn't do as well. My favorite bit of this is because we're going to have this consistent data structure underneath, I could create a stacked content property and then decide later, actually, I might want columns now. I'm going to add a grid. And you just change the doc type, the data type, and the data moves over. It will still save, it will still work, just you'll have a different editor experience. Because it's all strongly typed and based off doc types, it now becomes way easier to index and filter. So perhaps you want to only fetch the blocks that are text blocks. Well, you can do that just by filtering. And in the future, the idea is that instead of storing these, the content as JSON, we'll actually store a UDI, a reference. This opens up tons of possibilities for variant support, a bunch of other things.
Can you skip this one?
It's quite important. Quickly then. So these are two things that we've found from around the web, but two great things built by Matt and Lee, of course. Two complex layouts, examples of complex layouts. And we think this is the kind of thing that you should be able to do with the grid, in addition to these landing pages. We've built a bit of a demo. I guess I'll just keep talking, it'll be quicker. We built a bit of a demo, a really, really simple example of where you're editing content in line, picking some values, and saving that, and that just appears right now in a list. That's equivalent to stacked content, for example. Because we can swap the UI out, this exact same editor, just by adding a view, we can have a different layout. It's the same content, I can edit it in the same way, and I can then interact with the design as I want to do. All we've done here is changed the data type. As you can see, we can drag those around. We've also got some custom views here, so the places where you're seeing those images show up are a custom block, whereas the default one is just the text. We have two RFCs for this. We have our RFC for the incarnations that the grid might take, or the different editing experiences, and those will be for editors based off this idea of a block-based editor. That's a separate RFC, defining what data structure we're storing, what kind of APIs we need to be able to interact with it. We would love some feedback, and yeah, we'll be around all day to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.